Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome back to the third lecture on this course on international relations. So far what we've done in the first two lectures is to introduce you to the concept of international relations. In the first lecture we looked at the long history of the discipline starting from 1919. We also looked at the various ways in which one can look at IR itself. So there have been several theories in the last 100 years which have emerged. And today's class is the first class on theory where we are plunging straight into how to examine IR, and we are going to start with a theory called realism. The reason why we are starting with this theory is because it has the oldest tradition. It has one of the oldest traditions in IR. It has a long consistent narrative within international relations, and that is the reason. Realism is quite frankly, like the name suggests, a realistic account of the human civilization, the question of humanity, and that relates to war and violence. Almost every epic, whether it's Homer's Iliad, whether it is the Mahabharata, all ancient epics and narratives and ballads try and answer the fundamental question of what is the relationship of violence and humankind, what is the place of violence in civilization, and how does one categorize, how does one theorize violence? Is it a necessity? Can one do away with it? And if we look into our traditions within the South Asian subcontinent, we see that the Mahabharata is an epic which is persistently trying to answer that question of what is violence? Is war a necessity? Can one do away with war? And is suffering, is there a price of suffering? Is there a necessity to suffer? So the central questions, the central leitmotif, one could say, for realism is violence and war, and naturally these questions emerge because of the brutality at the battlefield, in the battlefield, the death of the ones we love, and the cost of war to civilization as a whole. So in today's lecture, what I'm going to do is take you through history, starting from the ancient Greek epics which deal with this question. Then we'll come down to IR as a modern academic discipline and try and understand how theorists have tried to analyze violence and war. So before we set out on this journey, the two questions that we are looking at, that we are circling upon, very much like vultures, are like other issues of violence and war. And we'll start with Krishna, who in the Mahabharata placates a very vexed, a very perplexed, a very worried Arjun when he asks about the consequences of taking on his very own family in the battlefield. And Krishna assures him that a war is necessary, and at times one has to do what one has to do, irrespective of the ethical and the emotional questions involved. So in many ways, this distinction between ethics and what is necessity is at the core of realism, that even though there is an admission that violence is horrific, violence is barbaric, violence is uncondonable, there is a place for it, there is a value for it, it is necessary in the way we conduct our everyday lives. Now, interestingly enough, we see the echo of this very idea in the Milesian dialogue, and this Milesian dialogue is a dialogue which is recorded in the Peloponnesian War. the war which took place between the Spartans and the militants. And this war was recorded quite assiduously by Thucydides. And in this, the episode that we're looking at is when the Spartans, and we know that the Spartans were a very disciplined, military trained, athletically inclined group of people who defeat the militants. The militants are peace-loving, they are meek, they are kind, they're not oriented to war. And when they are subjugated, the militants appeal to justice and they say that this is not fair. It is not fair for us to be conquered in this fashion. And this brutality is certainly not condonable. And it is here that the Spartans say what Krishna has just told Arjun. We mentioned that, I mentioned it a few minutes ago, that justice is what might dictates, and questions of ethics cannot be interlaced into the question of politics. Now, both of these illustrations from epics, incidentally, illustrate as to how ancient civilizations have dealt with the question of violence, and they have dealt with it by dealing with it clinically, which is that they have separated it from the realm of politics. Ethics is separate from the realm of politics, and one sees this down till when we look at Morgenthau's classic text published in 1948, Politics Amongst Nations. Now, before we proceed further, both these examples also illustrate as to even before the emergence of the modern state system as we know it, groups, clans, tribes, societies were warring with each other. And essentially, this ethical concern was pushed aside by those who favored the language of the powerful. So, what one sees is that questions of justice, mercy, humanity are seen as questions as of those who are weak, who are meek. And even though the Bible says the meek shall inherit the earth, we see that in the realist tradition there is a rejection of the weak's petition for justice, and this is a consistent narrative. Now, just moving on, in the 14th century, we see Machiavelli, the Italian writer, the Italian political theorist, echoing the same ideas, where he defines power as brute domination over others. And power in these narratives is seen as a form of control, as a form of domination, and it has to be the pursuit of power which defines politics. So, one can see very clearly that there is an emerging but artificial distinction maintained between questions of ethics and questions of power, and the pursuit of power is celebrated as that which is right, that which is necessary for an ordered society. Ordered society can only come from the source of power, and one can see that this is a place where, this is a time where there is a necessity to celebrate power for the purpose that it serves, and that is, of course, maintaining law and order. Now, through the several centuries between the 14th and the 19th century, which is where we'll be dwelling upon mostly, one finds that theorists throughout time have been looking at war and violence as necessary to the continuation of human existence or human civilization as we know it. There is the Chinese text Sun Tzu, The Art of War, which similarly places strategy, the military, the army as necessities to a stable state. And one can see quite clearly why that was the case. This was a time when societies were trying to stabilize themselves, and it was obviously not possible without brute, naked force. And we see that similarly being echoed by Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, the 16th century English philosopher, who argues that life is nasty, brutish and short, and the only way one can make do with what we have is by relegating, giving our authority over to the state, and the state is this all-encompassing Leviathan. And the Leviathan is a biblical monster. And it's very interesting that Hobbes portrays the state as a biblical monster emerging from the sea. And the reason is that the state is something which is not quite human, and therefore we cannot expect it to be humane. And on account of its natural brutality, its natural bestiality, violence and war are endemic to states and human nature. The argument here then is that humans, the state, and flowing from that, the world that we inhabit is a world in which violence is endemic. And I'd like to pause over here and look at this word endemic. We've looked at this word endogamous in the previous lecture, where we contrasted it with the word exogamous. And realist theory, like several other theories, starts off by looking at what constitutes international relations. We start off with the first image, and that is that of humans. And of course, I'm referring to Walz's conceptualization here. So the first image is at the human level, that's us. The second image is that of the state. And the third image is that of the structure. Now, these three categories, the unit, the state, and the system, are categories around which the subsequent theories will be aligning themselves. So it's quite worthwhile to spend a few minutes just trying to understand what it means. The easiest way to do that is to ask the question, what is the source of violence? Where does violence come from? And Hobbes would say that man by nature is selfish. And over here, male theorists, his reference point is men, are men rather. And to him, it is men who are brutal, who are nasty, who are violent. And if it is by nature, and by nature we mean something which is unchangeable, something which is immutable. Of course, this is the 16th century. Genetic modification did not exist at that time, and even then it is questionable whether science can change the nature of our beings. So the fundamental question being, the fundamental point being made was that at the core of our hearts, we are violent, greedy, narcissistic, quite unpleasant and unkind people, and therefore violence is endemic. And therefore the word endemic will mean it is inherent in us to be appropriative, to be exploitative, and therefore a world without violence is unnatural and subsequently inconceivable, and perhaps something not worthy to be pursued at all. So Hobbes has outlined the idea that we by nature are violent, and this is an idea which has been toyed fairly well by theoreticians, philosophers, poets throughout time. But now we come to the academization of international relations. What we've seen so far are people who are thinking about violence and war, but not as theoreticians of international relations. So we come to the starting point of where it all began, where IR began, and that is, of course, in 1919 at the end of the First World War. A very interesting period, a rich period, with several ideas bursting upon, mulling abated, and that is the First World War, which took place between 1914 and 1918. Now, the Great War challenged the ideas of violence and war in the minds of Western Americans and British philosophers who were mulling over the nature of this war, and more importantly were possibly aghast at the fact that Europeans were capable of this violence. So the First World War costed millions of lives, but it is not as if bloody wars like this had not taken place. We know that in the 18th century, the 16th century, there was the 100-Year War. Of course, it wasn't for 100 years, but it took a wide, it occupied the energies of Europe for a wide span of period. And then you have the 30 Years War between 1618 and 1648. So the point here is that war itself was not new to Europe, but nonetheless, the First World War vexed, troubled thinkers during this period, and therefore IR, international relations, was set up as an academic discipline in 1919, and the first department was set up in Aberystwyth in Wales. And when it was set up with an unreal idea of preventing the occurrence of such a war. And it is here that we come to the first realist theoretician who we will be looking at in today's lecture, and that is E.H. Carr. Now, just a little bit of a background as to why we are looking at E.H. Carr and why this period is so important. E.H. Carr is one of the three theorists we will be looking at. The others would be Hans Morgenthau, 1948 is the publication of his book, and subsequently we'll be looking at Kenneth Walls, who published his book in 1979. So these three moments, whether it is 1939 when E.H. Carr publishes his book, to Morgenthau, who's an American, to Walls, who's an American, indicates where realism is coming from and what it sets out to achieve. And let's therefore have a look at E.H. Carr first and try and understand where his sense of realism stems from. Now, Edward Hallett Carr was a British diplomat. He was part of the Versailles negotiations. He saw how British foreign policy worked closely as a practitioner. And in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. And the Treaty of Versailles is important because the victor states, that is France, Britain, and most importantly America, imposed upon Germany a set of conditions which involved not only demilitarization, they sent the King Wilhelm II to exile to the Netherlands, but most importantly they imposed a peace upon Germany, which involved Germany being a democracy amongst other things. Now, 1919 was a year when peace was being celebrated. After the many years of war, there was a moment of great peace. The victors were satisfied. They were looking for justice and retributive justice from the violence unleashed by Germany and its allies. And it is here that E.H. Carr writes his book, The 20-Year Crisis, which was published right at the eve of the Second World War, which started in 1939. So what is E.H. Carr trying to say, and why is he saying what he is? This is a moment of great peace. The 20 years between the two world wars was seen as a period of enforced peace. And it is here that Carr is raising several pertinent questions about the nature of peace and the nature of war. And the first question that E.H. Carr raises is this really peace, or is this an imposition? And the word imposition means something which is hoisted upon you, forced upon you. Has this peace been forced upon the losers of the war, or is it a genuine peace? Now that itself is a pertinent question, the nature of peace itself. Carr was trying to argue very elegantly that when victors enforce peace, that isn't real peace at all, because every loser, every state which loses in a war would rise up and try and defy that enforcement and that is what he calls revisionist state. So a revisionist state is a state which is discontent with the impositions and limitations of its boundaries, its demilitarization, and such a state would very naturally challenge those, and there would again be a war between the revisionist states and those who don't quite see it the same way. Very succinctly, Carr outlined as to how moments of peace were essentially the evolution of war, and that is precisely what happened in 1939 when the Second World War broke out. It was challenged, the order was challenged by those revisionist states who were discontent by the peace of the First World War, and we know that those are the states of Germany, Italy and Japan. They were hostile, ambitious, and rightly so. Every sovereign state aspires to extend its boundaries, and certainly Germany, Japan and Italy were not unusual or not different in that way. But Carr was reminding his readers and the world that peace is always an illusion, and there can be no peace because violence is again endemic to the structure. Now, Carr's book is seen as one of the early classic textbooks on realism. He was not a theoretician, he was primarily a historian, and of course we already know that he was a diplomat, so his narrative, his perspective dwells a lot upon history, but he is still, you wouldn't still quite call him a theoretician. And therefore we come to the next key realist thinker we are looking at in today's class, and that is Hans Morgenthau. And Hans Morgenthau writes his classic text, Politics Among Nations, in 1948. So let's just pause here for a moment and try and identify two major currents within realist thought. The first is from the Mahabharata to Thucydides to the Peloponnesian War to Sun Tzu. There is, number one, an understanding that violence is an essential feature of human life, human civilization. That is the first undercurrent of realism. And the second, of course, is that the only thing we can do is to regulate it. We can regulate violence, but we cannot stamp it out the way we would stamp out a disease. In short, violence is a part of our lives, and it is impossible to do away with it. Now, both of these undercurrents reflect in Morgenthau's text. Most importantly, Morgenthau looks at politics as being distinct from ethics. Now, we see that this has echoes of what takes place between the Spartans and the militants, and what takes place in the Mahabharata. Essentially, that ethics, if we define ethics as the concern for justice, what is right and wrong, what is moral and what is immoral, then politics has to be distinct from that. And therefore, Morgenthau puts forward his 6 principles of political realism. He is a theorist who is trying to codify realism. He's also an American who is writing just at the end of the Second World War. And we also know that at the end of the Second World War, America is taking on a role which it hadn't before. America joins the Second World War in 1941, much after it has begun. It began in 1939, reluctantly. And by the end of the Second World War, the USA is prepared to engage on a global level with the world, which was fairly unprecedented. The classic example, illustration for that is, of course, the fact that the Bretton Woods institutions, the Bretton Woods negotiations took place in America, where it designed certain institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT, which then became the WTO in 1995, as ways in which capitalism would be institutionalized through these global networks, through these international financial bureaucratic giants. So Morgenthau is writing his book in 1948, and the context to that period is the fact that America is taking on a global role, and he is also trying to look into the nature of foreign policy, the nature of power, the nature of a global great power set, the way America was positioning itself. And therefore, Morgenthau's 6 principles summarize what realism has been murmuring, has been whispering till this point. And of course, these 6 principles are the first codification in academic IR as we know it. Morgenthau's principles of political realism are steeped in the idea that IR can be like science. One sees this clearly when we will be discussing the 6 principles. Like several scholars before him, Morgenthau was trying to codify IR principles of politics in a manner mimicking science. Science is studies nature, can make predictions, scientists work in laboratories. There is a certain world that they inhabit. Morgenthau's inspiration for political realism distinctly, discernibly comes from science, especially when we look at his first one. So his first principle is that politics has objective laws, and violence comes from human nature. And again, this particular word objective that Morgenthau talks about, that politics is objective, and we will see that in the subsequent points that he makes about political realism. Now, it's a very interesting claim that Morgenthau makes through his principles. Now, that itself is a claim about on an understanding of what international politics is. Morgenthau is telling us that politics is objective and violence has roots in human nature, which means that it is something which is inescapable, which is endemic and fundamentally part of our everyday existence, part of societies and states. And war is a feature. One can apologize about it, but it is a permanent feature in international politics. The second one, Morgenthau examines the concept of interest, where he says that a state's interest is constant, it is universal, and a state's interest will always be guided by its strategic and military interest. Now, it is here that Morgenthau is codifying the state's interest above the people it governs, the citizens, the citizens within a state, and he is arguing that the state's strategic interest, the state's national interest comes much before everything, and it is the nation's foreign policy which will guide it to that. So these two things, military and strategic interest, are something which are inextricably linked to what a state's national interest is, and there are no questions posed at this point about whether that should be taken as it is, or there are certain assumptions that Morgenthau is making. The third point that Morgenthau talks about is that ethics and politics occupy a very different realm, and there can be no question of ethical concerns when it comes to national interest and national policy. And there again, we are reminded of the question of the just war, that certain wars are undertaken in the name of justice, and we can only think of the recent, in this very century, the war against terror led by the American President George Bush in the name of justice, in the name of setting things right. that certain ethical concerns can guide war. But over here, Morgenthau is telling us that politics and ethics do not naturally belong to each other, and there can be no confusion, there can be no fuzzy boundaries between the two. And even if a state upholds a certain moral order, it cannot be universal. So we come to the third point where Morgenthau tells us that even though a particular state can uphold a certain moral order, that moral order cannot be universal. And in a sense, a state's internal intention of structuring peace cannot be universalized. So over here, the term universalization means applicable to all states across time, and the opposite of the word universal would be particular. So over here, Morgenthau outlines as to how even if a particular state has a certain ideal to achieve, that in itself is a failed project because there is no space for a state's moral conceptualizations in the world of international politics. Therefore, we come to the fifth point where he tells us that even though a state's interest, particular interest may change across time, a state's military and strategic interest will be constant, which means that every state must prioritize its national interest, or else it will suffer consequences of being attacked or being conquered. And therefore, it is the obligation of the state. A state must therefore be militaristic, be strategic, and there is no way, there is no alternative to that. And finally, we come to the sixth principle, which argues that morals cannot be universalized. And in effect, Morgenthau makes three. If we look at these six principles and if we would come to the core of it, the core of it would be that politics is a space which is autonomous from ethics and moral concern. So what does this word autonomous mean? Autonomous means separated, something which can function independently and is not either dependent or inclined toward another sphere. And the term autonomy over here also refers to the ability of Morgenthau to make this artificial divide between politics and ethics. Every political act is an ethical act because there are lives concerned, but the separation, this artificial separation of politics and ethics, is that sphere upon which realism rests. So realism rests upon this artificial separation between politics and ethics. And of course, each one of us is a moral being where we ask questions about the righteousness, the rightness of actions taken by the state, be it a genocide, be it a violation of human rights. And these are questions which concern each one of us. So in many ways, realism is arguing that politics is separated from ethics, and that is the only way we can carry out brute acts of violence by classifying it as a question of realpolitik, that is, politics is real, and other questions are useful but need not come in the way in the exercise of the state's brutal might. In short, Morgenthau argues that the state's power cannot be questioned, cannot be held accountable by questions of justice, of rights, of the weak, of the disabled, of the people who are suffering, because it is autonomous, and therefore makes it extremely convenient for realists to argue that politics and ethics are separated. Of course, this is a question that we constantly question this separation, and we therefore come to the third and the last, perhaps the most groundbreaking theorist in within realism, Kenneth Waltz, who publishes his book Man's State and the War in 1979, A Theory of International Politics. But before that, just a little bit about the context. As we've looked in the previous lecture on theories of IR, when we look at a theory of IR, the theoretician is as important. His or her life, the scope of her inquiry, the object of her inquiry is equally illuminating as much as the book itself. So what a person is saying comes from a certain location, experience, a space and time, and drawing our attention to that allows us to understand why or what that person is saying. Now, Kenneth Waltz is also an American, and unlike Morgenthau, he is writing in the 1970s, and he is trying to reclaim the space for realism. The reason why he is doing that is because by the 1970s, it becomes increasingly clear that there are certain non-state actors who are occupying a space of influence comparable to the state itself. Now, these would be the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the GATT, sorry, because the WTO comes much later, the United Nations, the International Labour Organization. So, there is a multiplication of international organizations as non-state actors which are facilitating flows and networks in a way which hadn't been imagined before. So Waltz's book is a quest to reclaim that space. And what do we mean by reclaim? When something has been lost and you try and retrieve it is what we mean by reclaim. So Waltz is reclaiming that space for realism, and his theory of realism is a pivotal work, a paradigmatic work, and around which subsequent theories have revolved around either accepting, refuting, or borrowing parts of realism, and therefore neo-realism, that is Waltz's amendments to realism and his contribution to realism is called neo-realism, is a pivotal axis upon which realism rests upon. So what does Waltz tell us? Now, like Morgenthau, Waltz is modeling his theory on economics, on specifically microeconomics. And if Morgenthau was inspired by science, Waltz is inspired by the physiocrats in the 17th and 18th century who made an artificial boundary between political economy and other pursuits of knowledge in order to study it. What does that mean? That means that Waltz constructs a certain space within which he is going to build his theory, and obviously that space is artificially constructed, but as Waltz tells us that the test of any theory is its explanatory value. How does one evaluate a theory is whether it is explaining to us the reality that we seek to understand. And over here, his reality is the domain of international politics. So first things first, Kenneth Waltz wields his scalpel and he demarcates a space within which he is going to evaluate or explain what international politics is. Having done that, he proceeds to talk about the three images. Now, the three images are Waltz's way of dividing international politics into a certain space in order to understand and in order to put forward his theory. Now, it's very important to understand why Waltz is doing this. Waltz makes three compartments, slices international politics into three images. The first being man, the second being the state, that's the second level, and the third being the system or the structure. Now, Waltz argues that a major problem in the manner in which IR has been theorized is that it has looked at states determining the outside, which is an endogamous perspective, which is that if X states desires peace, peace is possible. Kenneth Waltz calls this a reductionist argument, and he dismisses it. He says that the world cannot be changed by the intentions, the zeal and the determination of one state. Then what is causing war? And it is here that Waltz poses his question, and his question is about the remarkable similarity in behavior of the USA and the USSR during the Cold War in spite of their ideological differences. Now, the year is 1979, it's the mid-1970s, it is right in the middle of the Cold War, and Waltz makes a striking observation that the USA is a democrat capitalist state, the USSR is a communist state. But in spite of their internal engineering and in spite of the internal ideological apparatus, both of their foreign policies are remarkably similar, which is that both of them are determined to further their national interest through strategic and military means. And it is here that Waltz draws our attention and puts forward his irrefutable argument that the source of war and violence is not in the individual, not in the state, but stems from the structure. Now, what he means by the structure is that every state behaves in a certain way, not because of the way they are designed internally, but because of the forces that shape it from the outside, and those are exogenous to it. In short, the structure, the ordering principle of the structure is what forces states, compels states to take on a militaristic and strategic outlook, and therefore we come to the first point of, there are 3 points to Waltz's theory. The first point is the ordering principle. What is the ordering principle of a space? So, Waltz says that within a state, the ordering principle is hierarchy. You jump a light, you get, you're issued a notice, there is a certain law and order in place, and you're subjected to it. And that is what he calls hierarchy. There is a sovereign state and it exercises power over us. The ordering principle of the international system, however, is anarchy. And anarchy is the state where there is no higher being above the state. There is no world police, there is no world, there is no authority higher than state. So, in effect, states are units, and Waltz uses the word units for states, that these units in the international structure have to depend on themselves in order to survive, and therefore survival is of foremost concern to these units. So, in short, the ordering principle compels states to act in a certain way, irrespective of whether they are democracies, whether they are dictatorships, irrespective of how they are shaped internally. It is the structure. Now, this argument powerful, it is persuasive because it is shifting the focus of violence from the individual to something beyond its control, and that is from the outside. So, Waltz tells us that the ordering principle of the structure is anarchy, and on account of that, every state is compelled to survive by taking on militaristic and strategic interests which are not ethical but nonetheless are necessary for its survival. And therefore, we come to the second principle that all units are alike in that way, irrespective of how they are shaped internally. Units are similarly bound and socially conditioned to place survival before other ethical and concerns of justice, and this makes all units similar. But it is also here that Waltz argues that there is a distinction between great powers and small powers, and we come to the third point, which is that even though units are alike, there might be a great variation between them in terms of their military might, in terms of their wealth, in terms of their geographic reach, and therefore Waltz makes a distinction between great powers and small powers, and it is great powers who shape the politics of the international domain, and therefore Waltz, Stephen Krasner, John Mearsheimer were preoccupied with the policies of great powers throughout time. So, in effect, Waltz does something remarkable, which is that he rests his theory on a clinically designed space and time, whereby he is asking a question and he provides the answer to that question by shifting our focus away from the individual, away from the state, and arguing that it is anarchy. Anarchy is what shapes the world, and it allows us to understand, explain, and describe at times confounding actions of the state which are unethical but nonetheless are necessary for the pursuit of foreign policy. Now, Waltz's theory from the time it was published has been powerful and persuasive, most importantly because it was swiftly canonized as one of the breakthrough theories within IR. The notion of anarchy and the havoc that it wreaks upon states is something which was also borrowed by the neoliberals. So, this addition, the term neo, so while Morgenthau is considered a realist, Waltz is a neo-realist, is because the neo bit is the shifting of the space of violence from the individual to the structure, and therefore he is a structural realist because he is fundamentally looking at how the structure shapes units and how it homogenizes foreign policy and norms and behavior of the state. So, before we look at the reactions of realist policy or realist theory and how it was received at the time, just to sum up what realism fundamentally is. Violence is an irreducible aspect of international politics. Ethics has no space in that realm, is what all realists broadly agree upon. Waltz is distinct in conceptualizing a theory where it is the structure which shapes the units, and units being the state. So, this relationship between the structure and the unit is of tremendous importance when we look at the explanatory value of Waltz's theory. Again, Waltz would tell us that the strength of a theory lies in what it can explain, what it can describe, and over here it has been remarkably successful in describing as to how all states spend vast amounts of money in militarization at the cost of human life, the quality of human life, at the cost of poverty and social inequalities. It explains as to how the national interest is always prioritized ahead of other internal politics. It also tells us that there is no force above the state, and while the domestic order is that of hierarchy, outside is a space of anarchy where it is the might of the right and it is the great powers which define what politics is. So Kenneth Waltz's text is of tremendous value on account of the simplicity, on account how parsimonious his theory is. It's an elegant book, but of course it has, there are several assumptions that Waltz make, and all of these were questioned in theories which critiqued and questioned neorealism itself. But the period that we're looking at is the 1970s, and it is in this period that Waltz's theory makes a certain headway and a mark which has stayed pretty much in its place, and there has been no scholar after Waltz to have changed the conversation and shifted it away from conversation. So although there have been critiques of Kenneth Waltz's neorealism, it has hovered around neorealism itself in fundamental ways. Right, so before wrapping up our class on realism and neorealism, just a few concepts which one must run through. Waltz's theory is a theory of power, where he's arguing that power is an inescapable part of international politics. But the most important aspect of his theory is that he's arguing that it comes from this structure. The ordering principle of this structure is anarchy, which compels states to devote a large amount of their energy and resources on militarization, on acquiring nuclear bombs, even though they may not afford it. So just as an example, the fact that India and Pakistan have tested the nuclear bomb at enormous financial cost points to the fact that the state's survival comes much ahead of its other priorities within the state. And it also leads us to the question of the security dilemma. Now, the security dilemma is the dilemma where if a state increases its military possessions, it thereby sets off a sense of anxiety and insecurity in its fellow states. The fellow state would then proceed to similarly acquire military weapons, strategic weapons of comparable utility, thereby setting off an endless spiral of insecurity. So the security dilemma is that dilemma whereby the acquisitions of weapons which stems from fear and the anxiety of being attacked is endless and infinite. It also points to the nuclearization of the world since 1948, when the first nuclear bomb, 1945 since the first nuclear bomb was tested. So the security dilemma points to how the structure compels states to behave in ways which are violent, militaristic and strategic. Another distinction which we can make within realism is that between offensive and defensive realism. The period in which Waltz is writing is the Cold War, and bipolarity, which is the balance between two superpowers, two great powers, is works for Waltz because it demonstrates as to how great powers balance the distribution of power and capabilities within the structure. But within that, Mearsheimer argues that we can also make a distinction between offensive and defensive realism. Offensive realism would be where a great power tries to establish hegemony, which is that it tries to overtake every space uh, within the world, within the structure, and is hegemonic in stifling all forms of opposition. And that is an overreach, and that is also an example when an empire overreaches or steps over its boundaries, it is also bound to collapse. A defensive realist, however, is one which tries to respond to those imbalances by structuring it internally, and therefore offensive and defensive realism are modifications made of Walz's theory of neorealism, where within great power politics, how great powers negotiate, navigate, and adjust that the struggle for power amongst themselves. So Walz's theory is insightful, it is incisive. It also tells us that great powers are the actors on the international stage, and in the distribution of capabilities of the unit, it are the great powers which make decisions for subsequent small powers. So in effect, to wrap the lecture on realism up, realism is a theory which is unapologetic about ethical questions. It shrugs them aside, it pushes them aside. It also analyzes closely the roots of violence by looking into the sources of it. The first image, like Hobbes, would argue that the source of violence is the individual. Morgenthau would argue that it is the state, and of course Walz's influential theory tells us that it is the structure which forces states to act in prioritize their national interest above each other. Now Walz uses a particular term that that states are socialized to act in a certain way, and it is this term which then becomes the platform upon which critical theorists, feminists and liberals and constructivists to unravel and question the assumptions of Walz's theory. So following the publication of Walz's theory, there have been in the 1980s several questions upon this, and we will be looking at that in subsequent classes. In the next class, we will be looking at feminism, liberalism, Marxism, and these theories have questioned the manner in which realism has been positioned and have rival explanations for the manner in which international politics has been designed. So I will see you in next class, where we will be looking at another theory of international relations.